A baby wore the last crown of Egypt. Not a warrior, not a statesman, not even a boy old enough to understand his own name. Fuad II was only an infant when he became king in 1952, crowned in law, helpless in life, while officers in uniform quietly pulled the throne out from under him. Somewhere beyond the nursery, orders were being signed. Palaces were being watched. A dynasty that had ruled Egypt for more than a century was being reduced to a legal fiction, and almost no one remembers the baby king. To understand how that happened, we have to move slowly. Not only through the fall of one royal family, but through the strange machinery of memory itself, the way nations decide which names belong in monuments and which are left outside the frame. Because Egypt's last monarchy did not vanish in a single night. It was weakened, polished, celebrated, compromised, resented, and finally erased. The story begins with an image that feels almost impossible: an empty throne, an absent father, a child king whose reign existed mostly on paper. Around him stood the remains of a royal world built on military ambition, European manners, Ottoman shadows, British pressure, and Egyptian longing. It was a kingdom full of chandeliers and uniforms, but also debt, hunger, humiliation, and suspicion. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. Tonight, we follow the bloodline that began with an outsider and ended with an infant. Not to restore a crown, not to bury it again, but to ask why Egypt's royal family became so difficult to remember honestly. Long before Egypt's last king was carried through history as a baby in exile, the dynasty itself began with a man who was not Egyptian. That detail is easy to pass over, but it matters. The royal family that would one day wrap itself in the language of Egyptian sovereignty began as something more complicated. A military household born from imperial disorder. Its founder, Muhammad Ali Pasha, came from Kavala in what is now northern Greece, then part of the Ottoman world. He was Albanian by origin, Ottoman by political setting, and Egyptian by destiny only after events gave him the chance to become so. Egypt at the turn of the 19th century was not a neat country waiting for a king. It was a prize, a battlefield, a province, a memory of older empires, and a place with its own deep social rhythms. The French invasion under Napoleon had shocked the region. The Ottomans wanted control restored. The Mamluks, who had long dominated Egypt's military and political life, were not ready to disappear. Local notables, religious scholars, soldiers, merchants, and peasants all lived with the consequences of power struggles that were usually decided above their heads. Into this confusion stepped Muhammad Ali. He did not arrive as the founder of a dynasty. He arrived as an officer. Like many men who change history, he seems more obvious in hindsight than he would have appeared at the time. He was part of the Ottoman effort to push the French out of Egypt. But after the French left, Egypt did not simply return to order. Competing factions remained. Authority was unstable. Armies were unpaid or restless. The Mamluks still had influence. The Ottoman center was distant enough to be challenged, but close enough to matter. Muhammad Ali understood something essential about power in such a landscape. Legitimacy could be assembled, not inherited cleanly, not granted once and forever. Assembled, He built relationships with soldiers. He presented himself as useful to the Ottomans. He learned how to deal with Egyptian elites. He waded through rivalries that destroyed other men. By 1805, with support from influential local figures and pressure from the political situation in Cairo, he was recognized as Ottoman governor of Egypt. Governor, not king. That distinction is important because the dynasty did not begin with a crown. It began with a governorship inside a larger empire. Muhammad Ali's authority was, on paper, delegated from the Ottoman Sultan. But on the ground, in Egypt, he began to act with a freedom that made the paper look increasingly thin. This is one of the great contradictions at the root of the Muhammad Ali dynasty. It was both Ottoman and not Ottoman, foreign-born and eventually Egyptian, modernizing and deeply authoritarian, dependent on imperial permission, yet constantly testing the limits of that permission. From the beginning, the family's power rested on a delicate performance. Obey enough to avoid immediate destruction, but command enough to become indispensable. Muhammad Ali was not a romantic liberator in the modern nationalist sense. To describe him that way would be to place later dreams onto an earlier century. He was a commander, a ruler, and a builder of state power. His ambitions were not modest, and his methods were not gentle. He wanted Egypt to become the base of his own power, and to do that, he had to break or absorb the forces that could challenge him. The Mamluks were the most dangerous of these forces. Their power had survived conquest, invasion, and humiliation. They were not simply a group of old warriors lingering from the past. They were a political class with networks, wealth, and armed followers. Muhammad Ali could not securely build a new order while they remained strong enough to undo him. The most infamous story connected to their destruction is the massacre at the Cairo citadel in 1811. Later accounts tell of Mamluk leaders invited to a ceremony, then trapped and killed. The details have been retold with the heavy atmosphere of legend. And like many political killings, the story has gathered dramatic color over time. What can be said with more confidence is that Muhammad Ali moved decisively to crush Mamluk power, and after that, no rival military household stood in Egypt with the same old authority. Once that obstacle was removed, his rule changed character. He was no longer merely surviving among factions. He was remaking the country into a machine that could serve his ambitions. This is where the story becomes larger than one man's rise. Muhammad Ali saw Egypt not only as territory, but as a base for armies, revenue, crops, factories, schools, and administration. He treated the country as something that could be reorganized from above. In that sense, he was one of the most important figures in the making of modern Egypt. But modern here should not be mistaken for free. His state could build, train, tax, command, and extract. It could open new paths for education and military advancement, but it could also tighten its grip on ordinary lives. There is a temptation, especially in stories about dynasties, to imagine bloodlines as ancient things. Families like to make themselves look inevitable. Palaces encourage this illusion. Portraits help. So do uniforms, ceremonies, and genealogies written in careful ink. But the Muhammad Ali dynasty was not ancient at all. It was a new creation, born from crisis. Its royal image would come later. At first, it was power in boots. The dynasty's later kings would inherit palaces, titles, European tutors, diplomatic rituals, and a national stage crowded with journalists and politicians. Muhammad Ali inherited none of that in any settled form. He had to create the foundation beneath them. He had to turn authority into administration, soldiers into an army, taxes into state revenue, and family ambition into hereditary rule. That last transformation was crucial. A governor can be replaced. A dynasty must convince people and other powers that succession through one family is normal. Muhammad Ali spent years pushing to secure hereditary control for his descendants. In 1841, after conflict with the Ottoman Empire and European intervention against his wider ambitions, his family's hereditary right to govern Egypt was recognized, though still under Ottoman sovereignty. It was a compromise. He did not become an independent monarch, but he made Egypt into a family possession in all but name. And this is where the shadow of the future first appears. The family that would later call itself royal did not rise from an uncontested national movement. It rose through Ottoman appointment, military force, local bargaining, foreign diplomacy, and personal ambition. That did not make it illegitimate in the terms of its own age. Many dynasties began in less tidy ways. But it meant the question of legitimacy never fully disappeared. Who did this family truly represent? The Ottoman order, Egypt itself, its own household, the modernizing state, the landowners and officers who benefited from it, the peasants whose labor paid for it? Different rulers would answer differently. Their enemies would answer more harshly. By the time the dynasty became fully wrapped in the symbolism of Egyptian kingship, its origin story had already become awkward. A foreign-born commander had made himself the master of Egypt, and his descendants would spend generations trying to turn that fact into a national myth. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they failed. Often, they did both at once. So when we look back from the image of Fuad II, the infant king with no real power, the beginning of the dynasty feels almost like a mirror image of the end. Muhammad Ali began with no crown, but gathered power until a dynasty formed around him. Fuad II inherited the crown after power had already gone elsewhere. One man built a throne before it had a royal name. The other received a royal name after the throne had become empty. The dynasty that Muhammad Ali built did not survive by ceremony alone. It survived because, for a time, it made itself useful. That may sound too plain for a royal story, but it is often the plain truth behind the silk. A throne becomes harder to remove when roads, schools, armies, ministries, crops, factories, and careers begin to depend on it. Muhammad Ali understood this instinctively. He did not inherit a modern state in Egypt. He tried to manufacture one. His project began with the army. For Muhammad Ali, soldiers were not simply defenders of territory. They were the spine of his political imagination. A disciplined army could protect him from rivals, pressure the Ottoman Sultan, expand his influence beyond Egypt, and prove to Europe that he was not merely another provincial strongman. But armies require more than uniforms. They require food, weapons, officers, records, transport, money, and obedience. So military reform pulled the rest of the country behind it. Fields became part of strategy. Villages became sources of manpower. Tax collection became more systematic. Agriculture was reorganized to serve state needs, especially through crops that could be sold for revenue. Cotton, in particular, would become deeply tied to Egypt's 19th century transformation. It brought money, attention, and vulnerability. A country can grow rich from a crop, but it can also become trapped by it. This is one of the details that changes the meaning of the dynasty's modernization. It was real, but it was not neutral. It did not descend gently from above like a gift. It was imposed, often harshly, through conscription, taxation, forced labor, and command. The state became stronger, but many ordinary Egyptians experienced that strength as pressure on their bodies, their harvests, and their sons. Still, something extraordinary was happening. Egypt, long treated by outside powers as a province, a prize, or a source of grain, began to develop institutions that looked toward a different future. Muhammad Ali sent students abroad. He brought in European experts. He supported technical schools and military training. He encouraged translation, printing, and administrative knowledge. He invested in industries connected to war and state power. Foundries, textile production, shipbuilding, and factories were all drawn into the larger dream of self-sufficiency. The word modernization can make this sound clean, almost mechanical, as if a ruler simply pulled Egypt from one century into another. But modernization is never just machinery. It is a rearrangement of human lives. A school opens, and a new class of officials becomes possible. An army expands, and families lose sons to conscription. A factory appears, and old patterns of labor bend around it. A canal is dug, a field is measured, a tax is recorded, and the state enters places where older forms of authority once mattered more. Muhammad Ali's heirs inherited both the achievements and the costs of this project. They ruled over a country that was becoming more administratively complex, more connected to global markets, and more visible to Europe. Egypt was no longer a remote Ottoman province in the old sense. It had an army with regional ambitions. It had a bureaucracy with growing reach. It had cities where European influence could be seen in architecture, language, education, and manners. It had a ruling family increasingly aware that prestige could be performed not only through force, but through the appearance of progress. Under later rulers, especially Said and Ismail, the dynasty continued to associate itself with grand projects and a more outward-facing Egypt. Ismail Pasha, in particular, wanted Egypt to be seen as part of the modern world. His famous ambition was to make the country appear not as a distant eastern province, but as something closer to Europe. That vision shaped boulevards, opera, infrastructure, diplomacy, and court culture. But Ismail's dream came with a bill, a very large bill. The dynasty's modernizing image was tied to debt as much as development. Railways, canals, palaces, ceremonies, and administrative expansion all required money. Foreign creditors became increasingly important. European financial control grew. The same modernization that was supposed to announce Egypt's strength helped expose its dependency. This was not simply a personal failure of extravagance, though extravagance played its part. It was also the trap of a country trying to buy sovereignty in a world where capital, empire, and diplomacy were already stacked against it. The Suez Canal, completed in the reign of Ismail, became the most vivid symbol of this contradiction. It made Egypt central to world trade and imperial strategy, yet it also deepened foreign interest in controlling Egypt. The canal was a triumph of geography turned into infrastructure, but it also made the country harder to leave alone. Here, the dynasty's story becomes almost painfully double-sided. On one side, there were schools, ministries, irrigation works, transportation links, urban improvements, and a growing idea of Egypt as a state with its own future. On the other, there was repression, exploitation, debt, foreign leverage, and an expanding distance between rulers and the people whose labor paid for royal ambition. A fair history has to hold both sides at once. It is too easy to treat the Muhammad Ali dynasty as either the heroic founder of modern Egypt or a foreign-rooted elite that merely prepared the way for occupation. Neither version is enough. The dynasty did help build the structures of modern Egyptian statehood. It also built them in ways that concentrated power at the top and burdened the rural majority. It created opportunities for new elites, while leaving many peasants exposed to the demands of a state that knew how to count them, tax them, and command them, but not always how to hear them. This tension would haunt the family for generations. Royal courts like to remember modernization through monuments, a school founded, a ministry organized, a harbor improved, a boulevard opened, a palace completed. Ordinary people remember it differently, if they are invited to remember it at all. They remember the official who came to collect, the son taken for service, the price of bread, the landlord, the debt, the gap between the ruler's promise and the village's reality. That gap matters because dynasties do not fall only when enemies attack them. They fall when their own story stops persuading enough people. For a long time, the Muhammad Ali family could say, "We are the builders. We are the reason Egypt is stronger than it was. We are the house that turned disorder into administration, weakness into an army, fields into revenue, and a province into a state." And there was truth in that. But there was another answer forming underneath it. Yes, you built, but who paid? Yes, you modernized, but for whom? Yes, you made Egypt visible to the world, but why did that visibility invite more foreign control? These were not abstract questions. They became political questions, then national questions, then revolutionary questions. By the time Egypt's monarchy entered the 20th century, the dynasty's greatest achievement had also become part of the case against it. The state it helped create had produced officers, officials, lawyers, journalists, students, and nationalists who could judge the throne in a new language. They did not only ask whether the ruler was strong, they asked whether he was sovereign, whether he was Egyptian enough, whether he served the nation or merely occupied the summit of it. That is the strange legacy of Muhammad Ali's modernizing house. It built the machinery that later made criticism sharper. It trained men who would eventually refuse to bow. It opened doors to ideas that could not be kept politely inside the palace. A dynasty can create a modern state, but once that state begins to imagine a nation, the throne is no longer the only voice in the room. A monarchy is never only a government, it is also a performance. In Egypt, that performance unfolded most vividly in Cairo and Alexandria, where the royal family learned to speak in the language of palaces, uniforms, receptions, carefully arranged marriages, court titles, imported manners, and public appearances staged with almost theatrical care. The dynasty had begun with a soldier who built power from confusion. Over time, his descendants surrounded that power with velvet. This was not just vanity. Splendor had a political use. A palace tells visitors where power lives. A procession tells the crowd what hierarchy looks like. A reception for foreign diplomats tells Europe that Egypt is not a backwater, not merely a province, not a place to be administered from someone else's capital. Court ceremony turns authority into something visible. It teaches people to look up. The Muhammad Ali dynasty understood this, especially as Egypt became more entangled with European influence. Royal life borrowed heavily from European styles: architecture, clothing, etiquette, language, education, and diplomatic ritual. Cairo's elite world became increasingly cosmopolitan, and Alexandria, with its Mediterranean face, seemed at times like a city listening in several languages at once. Greek, Italian, French, Arabic, Turkish, English, all could belong to the soundscape of power, commerce, and status. But beneath the glitter was a question Egypt could not easily answer. What kind of country was the monarchy supposed to represent? Egypt was formally tied to the Ottoman world for much of the dynasty's history. Its rulers bore titles shaped by imperial hierarchy before later becoming sultans, then kings. Its elite culture carried Ottoman traces in household structure, courtly habits, military traditions, and political vocabulary. Yet Egypt was not simply Ottoman. It had a much older identity rooted in the Nile Valley, in Arabic-speaking society, in Islamic learning, in Coptic presence, in rural life, and in a history so deep that every modern ruler looked temporary beside it. At the same time, Egypt sat in Africa, faced the Mediterranean, belonged to the Arab world, guarded the route to Asia, and attracted European ambition with almost magnetic force. It was not one thing. It was a crossing point, pretending, when necessary, to be a single image. The royal court tried to manage that complexity by becoming fluent in several symbolic languages. To European guests, it could appear modern, refined, diplomatic, and familiar. To local elites, it could present order, patronage, hierarchy, and access. To nationalists, when useful, it could speak of Egypt's dignity and independence. To religious audiences, it could lean into Islamic legitimacy. To the army, it could invoke discipline and command. This flexibility helped the dynasty survive. It also made it vulnerable to accusations of insincerity. When a ruler wears too many masks, people eventually ask which face is real. The palaces themselves became part of this problem. They were beautiful, of course. Royal architecture in Egypt could be dazzling, not only because of its scale, but because of its mixture of styles. European forms stood beside Ottoman echoes and local adaptations. The effect could be elegant, strange, sometimes excessive, but always revealing. These buildings were not just homes. They were arguments in stone and marble. They said Egypt belonged in the company of great states. They said the dynasty was cultured, wealthy, legitimate, and worldly. But architecture has a cruel honesty. It also records distance. For the court, splendor could mean legitimacy. For many ordinary Egyptians, it could mean separation. The more the monarchy shone, the more visible the darkness around it became. Not in a mystical sense, but in the hard political sense of unequal life. A palace reception does not look the same to a foreign ambassador as it does to someone struggling with rent, land, taxes, wages, or bread. This is where royal glamour becomes dangerous. It can inspire affection when people believe the crown represents their pride. It can provoke anger when people believe the crown represents their exclusion. In the early 20th century, especially under Fuad I and Farouk, the monarchy worked carefully to cultivate image. Photography, newspapers, official ceremonies, royal tours, religious occasions, military reviews, and public celebrations all helped turn the royal family into a national spectacle. The king was not only a political figure, he was a symbol that could be printed, framed, cheered, criticized, and mocked. Farouk would later understand the emotional power of image better than almost anyone in his family. As a young king, he could appear fresh, handsome, devout, patriotic, and charming. But before Farouk, the court world had already built the stage on which he would perform. It had already taught Egypt to look at monarchy not as a distant abstraction, but as a living theater of power. And court politics, like all theater, had backstage rooms. Behind ceremonies were rivalries between palace factions, politicians, courtiers, foreign advisors, military men, party leaders, and ambitious families. Access to the king mattered. A whispered recommendation could shape a career. A marriage could signal alliance. A dinner invitation could mean a door had opened. A royal displeasure could send people into the cold. The monarchy's public image was polished. Its inner life was often tense. This is not unusual. Courts throughout history have been machines for both ceremony and intrigue. What made Egypt's court especially fragile was the pressure around it. It was not operating in a sealed world. It stood between British power, nationalist politics, parliamentary struggles, old elite interests, rising middle-class voices, and the growing impatience of young officers. Every palace conflict could become part of a larger national argument. Was the king defending Egypt? Was he obstructing democracy? Was he resisting the British? Was he privately accommodating them? Was he a symbol of unity? Or was he another faction? Those questions could not be answered by chandeliers. Still, it would be too simple to describe the royal world only as decadence. That is how later Republican memory often preferred to frame it. The old order as a glittering shell, hollow at the center, waiting to be broken by history. There is some truth there, but not the whole truth. The monarchy's splendor also expressed a real desire among many Egyptians to see their country treated with dignity. After centuries of outside pressure and imperial condescension, the sight of Egyptian rulers receiving ambassadors, building institutions, and appearing on an international stage mattered. Symbols matter most when dignity feels insecure. That is why the monarchy could be admired and resented at the same time. Its ceremonies could stir pride, yet its extravagance could offend. Its European polish could signal modernity, yet also foreign imitation. Its Ottoman inheritance could give depth, yet also make it seem out of step with Arab nationalism. Its Egyptian claims could be sincere, yet complicated by the dynasty's origins and its dependence on outside powers. The kingdom over the Nile was never merely a kingdom. It was a balancing act performed in public. And every balance has a cost. The royal family had to look ancient enough to command reverence, modern enough to impress Europe, Egyptian enough to satisfy nationalism, Islamic enough to hold traditional legitimacy, and flexible enough to survive foreign pressure. No dynasty can sustain all of those expectations forever. Each role strengthens one audience while unsettling another. This is the hidden weakness inside Splendor. The more a monarchy depends on image, the more vulnerable it becomes when the image cracks. By the time Egypt's palace world reached its brightest glow, the foundations beneath it were already under strain. The court could still dazzle. The uniforms could still gleam. The receptions could still unfold beside the Nile with music, protocol, and careful smiles. But outside the gates, a different language was growing stronger, the language of occupation, sovereignty, corruption, sacrifice, and national dignity. The palace could stage Egypt as a kingdom, but it could not prevent Egyptians from asking who truly held power. There are thrones that fall because a king becomes weak, and there are thrones that weaken because everyone can see the king is not fully free. For Egypt's monarchy, this second danger was the more corrosive one. It did not always arrive with the sound of gunfire or the spectacle of invasion. Sometimes it appeared in quieter forms. A British official waiting in an antechamber, a diplomatic note delivered at the wrong moment, a cabinet pressured into resignation, a king reminded that his authority had limits he did not write. This was the shadow under which the Muhammad Ali dynasty entered the modern age. British involvement in Egypt did not begin as a simple story of conquest, though it eventually hardened into occupation. The roots were financial, strategic, and imperial. Egypt's debts opened doors to foreign control. The Suez Canal made the country too important for Britain to ignore. Whoever influenced Egypt influenced the road to India, the movement of ships, the balance of empire. In London, Egypt was not merely a country with its own political life. It was a position on the map that had to be secured. That is the coldness of imperial thinking. It turns living societies into roots. In 1882, after the Arabi movement challenged the old order and foreign influence, British forces occupied Egypt. They did not abolish the dynasty. That would have been too blunt and perhaps less useful. Instead, the monarchy remained in place, wearing the visible symbols of rule while British power settled behind and above it. This arrangement damaged the throne in a way that was slow but profound. A king or khedive could still appear at ceremonies. Ministers could still meet. Laws could still be issued. The machinery of government continued, but Egyptians could see, again and again, that the final weight of power often lay elsewhere. The crown was present. Sovereignty was conditional. This contradiction became one of the monarchy's permanent wounds. If the ruler cooperated with Britain, nationalists could accuse him of serving occupation. If he resisted too openly, he risked being pressured, isolated, or removed. If he tried to maneuver between the palace, parliament, and British officials, he could appear cunning to some and cowardly to others. The problem was not only what each ruler did. The problem was the structure itself. It made clean legitimacy almost impossible. Consider the humiliation built into the role. A monarch is supposed to embody national dignity. The crown, in theory, gathers the country into one figure. It gives the state a face, but under occupation, that face could be forced to smile while another hand controlled the room. The British presence turned royal ceremony into something unstable. Was it a sign of continuity, a cover for domination, a useful compromise, a national embarrassment? Different Egyptians answered differently, and their answers changed over time. Some elites benefited from the arrangement. Some believed cooperation with Britain could bring order, investment, or gradual reform. Others saw occupation as the central insult of modern Egyptian life. For them, the monarchy's survival under British protection or pressure made it suspect, even when individual rulers tried to assert themselves. A crown that could be overruled was not just politically limited. It was symbolically injured. This is why the British shadow was so dangerous. It did not merely restrict policy, it altered the meaning of the throne. The monarchy could claim descent from the builders of modern Egypt, from Muhammad Ali's army and administration, from the projects that had turned Egypt into a more powerful state. But British occupation asked a brutal question. If this dynasty built the state, why could it not defend its independence? The answer, of course, was not simple. Egypt was caught in a world of empires, debts, military imbalance, and strategic calculation. It is unfair to any single ruler could have easily pushed Britain out by force. But politics is not judged only by fairness. It is judged by perception, humiliation, and the emotional needs of a public that wants someone to blame. The palace became an obvious target. Over time, the British presence also complicated the relationship between the monarchy and Egyptian constitutional life. Parliament, parties, cabinets, palace influence, and foreign pressure formed a triangle of suspicion. The king might dismiss a government, the British might pressure the king, a party might appeal to the public against both. Nationalist leaders might accuse the palace of undermining democracy, while palace supporters might accuse politicians of weakening the country through factional struggle. In such a system, almost everyone could plausibly accuse someone else of betrayal. This created a political culture thick with distrust. Every decision seemed to carry a hidden sponsor. Every appointment could be read as a signal. Every crisis became a test of who truly ruled Egypt: the king, the elected politicians, the British residency, the army, or the street. The monarchy survived in this atmosphere, but survival is not the same as strength. In fact, survival under constraint can become a trap. The longer the dynasty remained, the more it absorbed public anger over conditions it did not fully control and compromises it did not always choose. Yet it also made its own choices, and some of them deepened the damage. A throne under foreign pressure has to be unusually careful. It must convince people that it is resisting as much as possible, compromising only when necessary, and protecting the national interest through difficult circumstances. Egypt's monarchy rarely managed to maintain that balance for long. At moments, it seemed too close to the British. At other moments, it tried to assert itself but lacked the power to make defiance decisive. The result was a cycle of suspicion. Each failed assertion made the palace look weaker, and each act of cooperation made it look less patriotic. This was especially visible in the 20th century, as Egyptian nationalism became more organized, more vocal, and less patient. The old language of dynastic authority no longer satisfied a public that wanted independence not as a court slogan, but as a lived reality. Students, lawyers, journalists, workers, officers, and party activists increasingly measured legitimacy against sovereignty. The monarchy's problem was that sovereignty remained incomplete. Formal changes could not erase this memory. Egypt's status shifted over time. Titles changed. The Sultanate gave way to a kingdom. Independence was declared in 1922, but even that independence came with reservations and continued British influence. The flag, the anthem, the royal ceremonies, the language of nationhood, all of it mattered, but none of it fully settled the question. Many Egyptians understood that the British had not simply disappeared because the paperwork had changed. This is where the dynasty's royal image began to fray in a more modern way. In the 19th century, legitimacy could still be built through conquest, administration, and elite recognition. By the 20th, legitimacy increasingly required national authenticity. The ruler had to appear not only powerful, but genuinely aligned with the people's desire for freedom. That was a much harder test. The British shadow made the kings of Egypt look like men standing in borrowed light. They had crowns, palaces, guards, titles, and official portraits. But behind each image lingered the possibility of interference. Behind each speech about sovereignty stood the memory of occupation. Behind each royal reception was the uneasy knowledge that foreign diplomats might carry more influence than elected ministers or even the monarch himself. And once people begin to see their ruler as supervised, reverence becomes difficult to restore. This does not mean the monarchy was merely a puppet, a word too simple for the tangled reality. Egyptian rulers maneuvered, negotiated, resisted, competed, and sometimes clashed with British power. They had ambitions of their own. The palace was not empty, but it was constrained, and those constraints were visible enough to become politically poisonous. That poison worked slowly. It moved through newspapers, speeches, private conversations, officer mess halls, university circles, and crowded streets. It fed the idea that Egypt's humiliation was not only imposed from outside, but tolerated from above. Whether that judgment was always fair mattered less than the fact that it became believable. A dynasty can survive criticism of its wealth. It can survive accusations of intrigue. It can even survive a foolish king if the institution still seems to protect something sacred. But it is much harder for a monarchy to survive the suspicion that the crown itself has become part of the nation's humiliation. By the time the final crisis approached, the British shadow had done more than weaken individual rulers. It had changed the emotional meaning of monarchy in Egypt. The throne no longer simply represented order, continuity, and dignity. To many, it had come to represent compromise without victory, sovereignty without control, and grandeur watched over by someone else's empire. The crown still glittered, but every glittering thing casts a shadow. Dynasties like to present succession as a smooth river. One ruler dies, another rises. A name passes from father to son, or uncle to nephew, and the state continues as if blood itself has solved the problem of power. On paper, it can look orderly. In portraits, it looks even better. Faces arranged in a line. Beards, medals, uniforms, sashes. A family tree pretending to be a national destiny. But the Muhammad Ali dynasty was never just a family tree. It was a chain of inheritances, and each ruler received more than a title. He inherited debts, foreign pressure, court rivalries, public expectations, and the unresolved question of what Egypt was supposed to become. The throne passed from hand to hand, but the burden underneath it grew heavier. Muhammad Ali had built the foundation through force and ambition. His successors had to live inside the structure he created. Some tried to expand it. Some tried to manage it. Some were overwhelmed by it. The dynasty's history after him is not a simple march from strength to weakness. It is more like a series of adjustments made under tightening pressure. Said Pasha, one of Muhammad Ali's sons, is often remembered in connection with the early history of the Suez Canal. His reign helped open the door to one of the most consequential projects in Egypt's modern story. The canal promised movement, wealth, prestige, and a new centrality in the world. But as so often in Egypt's 19th century, opportunity came braided with danger. What made Egypt valuable to global powers also made it harder for Egypt to control its own fate. Then came Ismail, the ruler whose ambition seemed almost equal to the scale of the Nile itself. Ismail wanted Egypt to appear modern, independent, and magnificent. He pursued infrastructure, urban transformation, education, administration, and international prestige. Under him, Egypt's court and capital took on a more European face. Cairo was reshaped in ways meant to announce a new era. The country seemed to be stepping onto the world stage with confidence. But Ismail's reign also exposed the dynasty's most dangerous habit: mistaking visibility for security. A ruler can build boulevards, host dignitaries, borrow money, and dazzle foreign visitors, yet still be weakening the ground beneath his own feet. Ismail's projects required immense financing. Debt brought foreign oversight. Foreign oversight brought humiliation. Eventually, financial crisis became political crisis, and Ismail was forced from power in 1879 under pressure from European powers and the Ottoman Sultan. That moment should be understood not only as a personal fall, but as a warning to the entire dynasty. It showed that Egypt's ruler could be removed when foreign interests found him inconvenient. The throne was hereditary, yes. It was prestigious, yes. But it was not protected from outside correction. The family could pass power through blood, but it could not seal Egypt off from the forces gathering around its economy and geography. Ismail's son, Tawfiq, inherited a throne already surrounded by distrust. His reign was marked by the Arabi movement, a nationalist and military challenge that expressed anger at foreign influence, elite privilege, and the domination of the officer corps by certain circles. The crisis ended with British occupation in 1882, and from that point onward, the dynasty's legitimacy entered a new and more painful phase. Tawfiq remained ruler, but British power stood behind the political order. To some, he became associated with survival through compromise. To others, he appeared as a ruler who had been preserved by foreign guns. That perception mattered deeply. A monarch does not need to personally create every national humiliation to be damaged by it. It is enough for people to believe that he benefited from it. After Tawfiq came Abbas II, who tried at times to assert himself against British control. His position was delicate from the beginning. He ruled under occupation, but he also knew that a ruler who seemed too submissive would lose national respect. His attempts to maneuver between Egyptian opinion and British power reveal the impossible geometry of the dynasty's situation. Move too close to Britain, and the palace looks compromised. Move too far away, and the occupier may decide the palace has become a problem. During the First World War, Abbas II was deposed by the British, and Egypt was declared a British protectorate. His uncle Hussein Kamel was placed on the throne as Sultan. Again, the lesson was unmistakable. Succession was not only a family matter, it was an imperial decision. Hussein Kamel's title also reminds us how fluid the dynasty's identity still was. These rulers were not always kings. They had been governors, khedives, sultans, and only later kings. Each title reflected not only personal rank, but Egypt's shifting relationship with the Ottoman Empire, Britain, and its own claim to sovereignty. A change in title could signal ambition, but it could also reveal dependency. Sometimes the crown changes shape because the hand above it has changed. After Hussein Kamel came Fuad I, who would become king after Britain's declaration of Egyptian independence in 1922. Fuad's reign deserves its own closer look, because he tried to turn the monarchy into the central symbol of a sovereign nation. But even before we reach him, the pattern is clear. The dynasty had become expert at adaptation, and adaptation had kept it alive. Yet adaptation also made it look unprincipled to critics. Every compromise preserved the throne while quietly weakening the story that justified it. Then came Farouk, the glamorous young king, whose reign would begin with hope and end in exile. Farouk inherited not only the palace but the accumulated contradictions of the entire dynasty. He inherited the dream of national dignity, the resentment of British influence, the rivalry between palace and parliament, the expectations of a young public, and the suspicion that the monarchy was too wealthy, too foreign-shaped, too detached, and too entangled with the old order. By the time Fuad II briefly became king as an infant, there was almost nothing left for bloodline to solve. This is the deeper point about dynastic succession in Egypt. Legitimacy was never carried by blood alone. Blood could explain who came next. It could not explain why the country should obey. For a dynasty born from military power, strengthened by modernization, decorated by court culture, and constrained by empire, every ruler had to renew the argument for monarchy in his own time. Some renewed it better than others, but the questions kept returning. Was the ruler the guardian of Egyptian independence, or a negotiator of Egypt's limitations? Was he the heir to Muhammad Ali's modernizing state, or the beneficiary of a system that pressed too heavily on ordinary people? Was the palace a symbol of national dignity, or a stage set built too close to foreign power? Was the dynasty Egyptian by service, by time, by rule, by language, by loyalty? Or was its origin as an outsider's military house never fully forgotten? There is no single answer, because different Egyptians saw different monarchies. A landowner might see order. A nationalist student might see compromise. A courtier might see tradition. A young officer might see decay. A rural family might see taxation, conscription, and distance. A foreign diplomat might see a useful institution. The palace had to carry all those meanings at once, and eventually the weight became too much. The tragedy of the Muhammad Ali dynasty is not that it lacked importance. It had enormous importance. It shaped modern Egypt in ways that could not simply be erased, even by a republic determined to bury its image. The tragedy is that its achievements never fully cured the original wound in its legitimacy. It had built a state, but the nation that emerged within that state became increasingly unwilling to treat the royal family as identical with Egypt itself. And once a nation separates the idea of itself from the family that rules it, succession becomes fragile. The next king may inherit the palace, but he no longer automatically inherits belief. Fuad I inherited a throne that looked grand from a distance and unstable up close. That was the peculiar condition of Egypt after the First World War. The country had changed titles, changed expectations, and changed its political temperature. The old protectorate could no longer be dressed up as normal. Egyptian nationalism had become too loud, too organized, too emotionally charged to be treated as a temporary disturbance. Britain's declaration of Egyptian independence in 1922 seemed, on the surface, to open a new chapter in national life. But independence came with strings still visible. Britain reserved influence over key matters, including imperial communications, defense, foreign interests, and the status of Sudan. So Egypt had a king, a constitution, a parliament, ministries, flags, ceremonies, and the outward structure of sovereignty, but not complete freedom of action. The result was a kingdom born with an argument already inside it. Fuad understood the opportunity. He also understood the danger. Before 1922, he had been Sultan Fuad. After the Declaration of Independence, he became King Fuad I. That change in title was not a trivial decoration. It was a political statement. A sultan belonged to a world of Ottoman echoes and wartime protectorate arrangements. A king could claim to stand at the center of a modern nation-state. The crown had been redesigned for a new age. Fuad's task was to make that redesign believable. He wanted the monarchy to become more than a family inheritance. He wanted it to become the symbol of Egypt itself. Sovereign, dignified, continuous, and above the disorder of party politics. This was not an irrational ambition. Many monarchs in newly independent or semi-independent states tried to present themselves as guardians of unity. In a country divided by foreign pressure, party rivalry, class tension, and unresolved constitutional questions, the palace could argue that it represented stability. But Fuad's idea of stability was not the same as parliamentary democracy. This is where his reign becomes essential to understanding the monarchy's later fall. Fuad was not simply a decorative king waiting to be overthrown by history. He was an active political player. He tried to shape the constitution, influence governments, manage ministers, and preserve strong royal authority. He did not want the throne to become a ceremonial chair in a system controlled by elected politicians. He believed the palace had a right to command. To his supporters, this could look like necessary firmness. Egypt's party politics, especially the struggle between the palace, the Wafd, smaller parties, and British pressure, could be chaotic and bitter. A king who intervened might present himself as the only force capable of preventing factional paralysis. To his critics, the same behavior looked like royal obstruction, a ruler weakening constitutional life because he preferred personal authority. Both interpretations tell us something. Fuad operated in a political system where no institution fully trusted the others. The palace distrusted the mass popularity of the Wafd. The Wafd distrusted the palace's willingness to limit parliament. The British distrusted any Egyptian force that might threaten their strategic interests. Smaller political groups maneuvered between them all. The public watched a kingdom that promised national dignity, yet often seemed consumed by elite conflict. Fuad tried to stand above this conflict, but he was also deeply inside it. That contradiction gave his monarchy a tense, almost double identity. Publicly, the king was the national father, the sovereign, the embodiment of Egypt's new status. Politically, he was a competitor. He negotiated, pressured, dismissed, appointed, and maneuvered. The more he acted like the master of politics, the harder it became for him to appear above politics. And yet, Fuad also understood symbolism with remarkable seriousness. He supported the construction of royal prestige through ceremonies, state occasions, official culture, education, and institutions. The monarchy needed a national language, not just a dynastic one. It had to connect itself to Egypt's past and future at the same time. The king's image had to suggest continuity with the old Muhammad Ali house, but also renewal after independence. This was a delicate performance. Egypt's ancient past was powerful, but no modern ruler could truly claim to be heir to the pharaohs in a simple way. Egypt's Islamic and Arab identities were central, but the monarchy's own household culture carried Ottoman and European traces. The dynasty had foreign origins, but had ruled Egypt for generations. Fuad's kingdom needed to make all these layers feel less like contradictions and more like depth. In some ways, he succeeded. The monarchy under Fuad did become more formal, more nationally framed, and more visible as the central institution of the state. His reign helped shape the habits of kingship that Farouk would later inherit. The ceremonies, the public expectations, the sense that the royal family was not merely ruling Egypt, but performing Egypt before itself and the world. But Fuad's success contained a danger for his son. By strengthening the crown's image, Fuad also raised the emotional stakes. A king presented as the guardian of sovereignty must deliver dignity. A king presented as father of the nation must seem morally serious. A king presented as above faction must not look like the leader of a faction. If later events exposed weakness, indulgence, or political manipulation, the disappointment would be sharper because the promise had been so high. Fuad's reign also left unresolved the deepest national questions. British influence remained. Parliamentary life remained unstable. The relationship between palace authority and popular politics remained contested. Social inequality did not vanish under royal ceremony. The army watched. The press watched. Young Egyptians watched. This matters because Fuad I is sometimes overshadowed by Farouk's more dramatic story. Farouk gets the glamour, the scandals, the coup, the exile, the final cinematic departure. Fuad appears more severe, less romantic, less suited to legend. But Fuad built the royal system that Farouk would later inhabit. He strengthened the crown as an institution while also sharpening the conflicts around it. He made the monarchy more serious. He also made it more exposed. A weak king might have allowed parliamentary forces to absorb public anger. A purely ceremonial king might have survived as a symbol while politicians took the blame. But Fuad insisted that the palace mattered. He placed the crown at the center of the national argument. That gave the monarchy power, but it also gave the public a clear target when promises failed. In the 1920s and 1930s, Egypt's kingdom looked as if it might still find a working balance. The monarchy had history, parliament had legitimacy, nationalism had energy. Britain still had influence, but not the easy confidence of earlier occupation. A careful settlement might have allowed the crown to evolve into a constitutional symbol of unity. But history does not reward institutions for what they might have become. Fuad died in 1936, leaving the throne to his young son, Farouk. The timing gave the succession an almost theatrical charge. Egypt did not receive a tired old monarch shaped by decades of suspicion. It received a handsome young king, educated, charming, and surrounded by public hope. Fuad had worked to make the crown powerful. Farouk would inherit that power wrapped in emotion. The country was ready to believe again. And that, for a monarchy already carrying so many contradictions, may have been the most dangerous gift of all. When Farouk came to the throne, Egypt did not simply receive a new king. It received a possibility. He was young, handsome, and easy to imagine as the answer to several national disappointments at once. After the severity of Fuad I, Farouk appeared warmer, more accessible, more emotionally available to a country tired of being managed by older men with careful expressions and cautious promises. He had the face of renewal, and monarchies depend more on faces than they like to admit. A photograph can do political work. Farouk's early image carried almost everything the kingdom needed. He looked modern without appearing rootless. He could be presented as devout without seeming narrow. He belonged to the royal house, Yet his youth allowed many Egyptians to project onto him the idea of a fresh beginning. In a country still wrestling with British influence, parliamentary tension, and the memory of incomplete independence, he seemed capable of becoming the monarch Fuad had wanted the crown to produce, the living symbol of a sovereign Egypt. That hope was not foolish. It was human. Nations under pressure often search for a figure who can make dignity feel personal. Institutions are abstract. Constitutions are difficult. Diplomatic negotiations are slow and unsatisfying. But a young king can be seen, greeted, cheered, placed on postcards, written about in newspapers, and imagined into something larger than himself. Farouk's early popularity tells us less about one man's virtues than about Egypt's hunger for recognition. People wanted to feel that the crown belonged to them. He seemed at first to understand that. Farouk cultivated a public image that connected him to ordinary Egyptians more directly than the older royal style had done. He appeared at public events, associated himself with Islamic observance, and allowed himself to be seen as a king with national feeling rather than merely courtly polish. This mattered in a country where the monarchy's foreign-shaped habits had long made it vulnerable. A ruler who could appear genuinely Egyptian, genuinely pious, and genuinely young, offered the palace a chance to soften its edges. There was also the glamour. It is impossible to tell Farouk's early story honestly without admitting the power of glamour. He was not merely a constitutional figure. He was a celebrity before modern celebrity culture had fully taken its present shape. Newspapers followed him. Society watched him. Foreign observers studied him. Young people saw in him a kind of royal modernity. Cars, clothes, youth, charm, and the promise of a state that could stand elegantly among nations. But glamour is a risky form of credit. It allows a ruler to spend admiration before he has earned trust. Farouk inherited a political world more dangerous than it looked. The palace had authority, but that authority was contested. The Waft remained a powerful force. British influence remained the central national injury. The army had its own resentments. Social inequality was obvious. The machinery of constitutional monarchy functioned, but often with friction. And the young king, instead of being gradually trained in a calm system, was placed at the center of a storm that had been gathering long before his birth. This is an important correction to the simplest version of his story. It is tempting to say that Farouk began as hope and then personally ruined everything through indulgence. There is truth in the moral decline people later saw in him, but the monarchy's crisis cannot be reduced to one man's appetite. Farouk inherited a crown already burdened by occupation, debt, elite rivalry, and public suspicion. His personal failures mattered because they confirmed a case that many Egyptians were already prepared to believe. In the beginning, though, that case had not yet hardened. When he was young, Farouk could still appear as the bridge between palace and people. He had the advantage of contrast. Fuad had been formidable, politically controlling, and often distant. Farouk seemed less severe. He could smile where his father had commanded. He could make monarchy feel less like a locked room. That difference gave him emotional power. And Egypt, at that moment, needed emotion. The 1936 Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, signed in the early period of Farouk's reign, promised changes in the relationship with Britain, including the withdrawal of British troops from most of Egypt while maintaining a British military presence in the Suez Canal zone. To many Egyptians, this did not deliver full independence, but it did suggest movement. Farouk's youth became entangled with that atmosphere of partial release. The kingdom seemed to be stepping toward greater control over its own affairs, even if the path remained narrow and watched. For a time, the king's image benefited from ambiguity. Because he was young, failures could be blamed on advisors. Because he was new, old conflicts could be treated as inherited. Because he was charming, people could forgive what they might condemn in a colder ruler. The public did not yet know which Farouk would emerge: the patriotic monarch, the palace manipulator, the indulgent prince, the wounded son, the careless sovereign, or some unstable mixture of all of them. The court around him understood that his body, habits, marriage, clothing, ceremonies, and appearances were now part of national politics. A king's private life is never entirely private, especially when a nation has been taught to look at him as a symbol. The young Farouk's marriage, his movements, his religious gestures, and his relations with politicians all became material for public interpretation. That is the burden of being made into hope. Every gesture becomes evidence. In those early years, the evidence often seemed favorable. Farouk could still inspire affection across social lines. He represented continuity without yet carrying the full stain of continuity. He represented youth without yet revealing the dangers of immaturity. He represented sovereignty without yet being blamed for its incompleteness. But underneath the applause lay a fragile bargain. Egyptians were willing to believe in Farouk so long as he seemed to believe in Egypt more than in the palace. They could admire his glamour so long as it appeared to reflect national pride, not personal excess. They could accept his authority so long as it seemed directed toward independence, dignity, and reform rather than court intrigue. A monarchy is strongest when the people's imagination works on its behalf. For a few years, Farouk had that advantage. He did not have to force the myth. The myth came toward him. It dressed him in expectation. It made his youth look like destiny. It turned his smile into a political resource, and perhaps that was part of the tragedy. Farouk was not only corrupted by privilege, if that is the word we choose, he was also inflated by hope. He was asked to become the answer to problems older, deeper, and harder than any young king could easily solve. The British presence could not be charmed away. Constitutional conflict could not be solved by popularity alone. Inequality could not be hidden forever behind royal ceremony. The army's frustration would not disappear because the king looked good in uniform. The golden boy of Egypt entered history as a promise. But promises are dangerous things for rulers. They do not remain beautiful unless someone pays the cost of keeping them. And Farouk, still young, still adored, still surrounded by mirrors, had inherited a country that was beginning to demand more than a reflection. The fall of Farouk did not begin with tanks outside the palace. It began earlier, in the slow change of atmosphere around him. A joke sharpened. A newspaper item lingered. A rumor found an audience. A public appearance that once inspired affection began to invite comparison. The king who had entered Egyptian life as a golden promise gradually became, in the eyes of many, a symbol of everything spoiled, indulgent, and unserious at the top of the state. This transformation did not happen in a single scandal. That is important. Monarchical reputations usually collapse by accumulation. At first, Farouk's flaws could be explained away. He was young, he was badly advised. He had inherited a difficult system. He was surrounded by courtiers, politicians, British pressure, party rivalries, and the expectations of a restless country. A generous public can forgive a great deal when it still wants to believe. But forgiveness has a shelf life. As Farouk's reign continued, accusations of excess became harder to separate from the image of the crown. Stories circulated about his appetite for pleasure, his gambling, his possessions, his women, his impulsive behavior, his court intrigues. Some stories were exaggerated, as stories about fallen kings often are. After a monarchy collapses, memory becomes greedy. It collects every rumor and arranges them into a moral lesson. The evidence is not equal for every tale, and a careful history should not treat palace gossip as courtroom proof. But reputation does not require proof in the legal sense. It requires repetition, plausibility, and a public mood ready to believe the worst. Farouk gave his critics material. His lifestyle appeared increasingly distant from the hardship of ordinary Egyptians. The palace seemed absorbed in its own dramas, while the country struggled with poverty, political instability, and the unfinished question of national independence. The monarchy still wore the costume of dignity, but its behavior seemed to many observers less dignified than theatrical. This is where the problem became larger than personality. A king's private indulgence becomes politically explosive when it confirms a national suspicion. Farouk was not merely accused of being pleasure-loving. He was accused, in effect, of proving that the monarchy no longer understood Egypt. The royal world seemed too comfortable, too insulated, too interested in status and intrigue. While outside its gates, people faced rising frustrations that could not be dismissed as impatience. The palace, meanwhile, remained deeply involved in politics. Farouk did not become a neutral constitutional figure. He maneuvered among parties and ministers, sometimes exploiting divisions, sometimes being trapped by them. Cabinets rose and fell. Palace influence competed with parliamentary forces. The Wafd, with its strong nationalist base, continued to challenge royal authority. Smaller parties and political figures moved through the cracks. British power remained in the background, sometimes less visible than before, but never irrelevant. To ordinary citizens, this could look like endless elite games. One of the monarchy's great weaknesses was that it had no convincing answer to political instability. If Parliament was chaotic, the palace seemed manipulative. If the palace intervened, Parliament seemed undermined. If the British applied pressure, everyone appeared compromised. If the king claimed to defend sovereignty, critics asked why occupation and foreign influence persisted. Every institution seemed to be accusing every other institution of betraying Egypt, and the public had good reason to suspect that none of them was innocent. Farouk's court added a more personal kind of irritation to this already tense system. Courtiers mattered too much. Access mattered too much. Personal favor mattered too much. A modern state cannot easily tolerate the feeling that decisions are being shaped by whispers, rival households, private grudges, and royal moods. Even when such impressions are partly unfair, they can become devastating. The appearance of arbitrary power corrodes respect. People may accept authority, but they resent caprice, and Farouk increasingly looked capricious. His early charm, once a political asset, began to curdle into a different image. The charming man who could not be trusted with seriousness. The youthful warmth that once softened the monarchy now suggested immaturity. The glamour that once reflected national pride began to look like self-indulgence. What had been admired as royal style was reinterpreted as decay. That reinterpretation matters because history often changes the meaning of the same object. A palace banquet, in a hopeful moment, can look like national confidence. The same banquet, in a hungry moment, looks obscene. A king's jewels can look like state splendor when the monarchy is loved. When the monarchy is hated, they look like stolen light. A ruler's European polish can look cosmopolitan under one mood, foreign and decadent under another. Farouk did not change alone. Egypt's gaze changed with him. The press, political opposition, and urban rumor networks all helped transform the king into a figure of mockery and anger. This does not mean every criticism was fair. Some were moralistic, some were opportunistic, some likely grew in the telling, but they found traction because the monarchy's protective myth had weakened. Once the public stops believing that a ruler's flaws are exceptions, each flaw becomes evidence of the whole system. The palace began to represent rot. That word is harsh, but politically precise. Rot is not the same as sudden destruction. It is internal weakening. From the outside, the structure may still stand. Guards remain at the gates. Ministers arrive in cars. The king receives guests. Ceremonies continue. The newspapers still print official photographs. The national anthem still plays. But inside public imagination, the institution has begun to lose the right to be taken seriously. For a monarchy, that can be fatal. Farouk's Egypt was also changing socially. New groups were more politically aware, more literate, more connected to newspapers, parties, professional associations, and the army. They were less likely to accept old forms of deference simply because a king appeared in uniform. The monarchy had to justify itself in a more argumentative public sphere. It was no longer enough to look splendid. It had to look useful, moral, patriotic, and competent. Farouk struggled to appear all four at once. The irony is that the more his reputation declined, the more the monarchy leaned on the same tools that had once worked: ceremony, image, court management, political maneuver. But old tools can become embarrassing when the audience has changed. A polished image does not solve a credibility crisis. It can even deepen it by making the distance between appearance and reality more visible. This is why the phrase decadent monarchy, though often used too easily, became so powerful in later Republican memory. It gave people a simple explanation for a complicated collapse. The king was corrupt. The court was rotten. The old elite had failed. The revolution swept them away. Like all simple explanations, it hides as much as it reveals. British influence, constitutional conflict, social inequality, military frustration, and regional war all mattered. But Farouk's behavior made the simple explanation believable. He became the face of decline. That may be unfair in scale, but not in consequence. Leaders are often punished not only for what they do, but for what they come to symbolize. Farouk symbolized a monarchy that had lost discipline, a ruling class that enjoyed privilege without responsibility, a state that spoke of independence while remaining compromised, a political order that debated dignity while failing to deliver it. And once that symbol hardened, affection was difficult to recover. By the late 1940s, the distance between Farouk's early promise and his later image had become one of the central tragedies of the dynasty. The boy king, who had seemed to carry Egypt's hopes, now seemed unable to carry even the moral weight of his office. Around him, the palace still glittered, but glitter had become suspicious. Every shine invited the question of what it was hiding. The monarchy had not yet fallen, But the emotional abdication had begun. Long before Farouk signed away the throne, many Egyptians had already withdrawn from the myth that sustained it. There are defeats that change borders, and there are defeats that change the way a country looks at itself. For Egypt's monarchy, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War became the second kind. It was not only a military failure. It was a moral shock, a political accusation, and a public humiliation that settled over the kingdom like smoke after a fire. Whatever confidence remained in the palace was now forced to pass through the memory of soldiers sent into war under a system many believed was corrupt, unprepared, and dishonest. The war did not create all of Egypt's anger. It concentrated it. By 1948, Farouk's reputation was already damaged. The palace had become associated with excess and intrigue. British influence remained a wound. Parliamentary politics were unstable. Social inequality was visible enough to make royal luxury feel less like national splendor and more like provocation. But before the war, these grievances still belonged to different conversations. Some people complained about the king. Others complained about Britain. Others condemned politicians, landlords, or the old elite. The war gave them a shared language: failure. That word can be brutal in political life because it simplifies everything. A complicated web of causes becomes a single judgment. The army failed. The government failed. The palace failed. The old order failed. Once that judgment enters the bloodstream, every earlier scandal seems less like an isolated weakness and more like evidence leading to a verdict. The conflict in Palestine was charged with emotion across the Arab world. It touched questions of nationalism, colonialism, religion, regional leadership, and post-war identity. For Egypt, participation carried the promise of honor. The monarchy and political leadership could present the war as a defense of Arab dignity and a chance to assert Egypt's role beyond its borders. But wars are merciless tests of states. They expose logistics, command, training, morale, supply chains, corruption, and political seriousness. In Egypt's case, what many officers saw was not glory. They saw confusion. The details of battlefield experience varied, and no single explanation can capture the entire campaign. But the perception that mattered afterward was clear enough. Egyptian soldiers had been asked to fight while their own state was riddled with incompetence. Stories spread of poor planning, bad equipment, and corrupt procurement. One of the most damaging accusations concerned defective weapons, a scandal that became fixed in public memory even where the precise responsibility was debated. Whether every claim was accurate in every detail mattered less than the fact that the story felt believable. That believability was deadly. A monarchy already accused of indulgence could perhaps survive tales of gambling or palace excess. It could laugh them off, deny them, smother them in ceremony. But accusations that soldiers had been betrayed by corruption cut far deeper. They moved the critique from morality to blood, from gossip to sacrifice. If young men had gone to war with inadequate arms while elites enriched themselves or looked away, then the old order was not merely decadent, it was dangerous. This is the moment when military resentment began to take on a different force. The army had long been part of Egypt's political story, from Muhammad Ali's reforms to the Urabi movement and beyond. But after 1948, younger officers increasingly viewed themselves not just as servants of the state, but as witnesses against it. They had seen defeat up close. They had endured the consequences of decisions made by men in palaces and ministries. They had returned with anger that could not easily be contained within formal discipline. Among these officers, humiliation became a political education. It is important not to imagine them all as identical or pure. Armies contain ambition, rivalry, ideology, resentment, patriotism, careerism, courage, and vanity, often in the same room. The officers who would later help overthrow the monarchy were not saints stepping out of a patriotic mural. They were men shaped by their age, anti-imperial, frustrated, secretive, and increasingly convinced that Egypt's civilian and royal leadership could not rescue the country. But their anger had power because it touched a broader national feeling. The defeat in 1948 made the monarchy look incompetent at the one task monarchies often claim as sacred: protecting national honor. Farouk had cultivated the image of king, patriot, Muslim ruler, and national symbol. Yet after the war, that image seemed almost unbearable to many critics. How could a king preside over such embarrassment and still ask for reverence? How could the palace continue its rituals when the army had been exposed and the nation humiliated? War compresses time. It makes political decay suddenly visible. What had once looked like palace misbehavior now looked like a symptom of state failure. What had once seemed like party bickering now looked like paralysis. What had once been foreign interference now looked like proof that Egypt still lacked true sovereignty. And Farouk, already weakened by reputation, became the easiest figure onto which all these meanings could be placed. The king did not personally command every unit or design every policy, and a careful account should not pretend he alone lost the war. But monarchy is not an ordinary office. Its symbolic power is part of its attraction and also part of its risk. If the crown claims to embody the nation, then national humiliation stains the crown. The more sacred the symbol, the deeper the stain. After 1948, Egypt's political system became harder to defend. The Wafd, the palace, smaller parties, ministers, military leaders, and British interests continued their maneuvers, but the mood had shifted. Many Egyptians no longer saw instability as a temporary problem. They saw it as evidence that the entire arrangement was exhausted. Strikes, protests, political violence, anti-British anger, and distrust of the elite all belonged to the atmosphere in which conspiracy could grow. Conspiracy is not born only from ideology. It is born from the belief that normal channels have become useless. For younger officers, the lesson seemed plain. Speeches had not liberated Egypt. Parliamentary bargaining had not removed British influence. Royal ceremony had not produced competence. The war had not brought honor. If the country was to be remade, perhaps it would not be remade by lawyers, courtiers, or party leaders. Perhaps it would be remade by men with uniforms, secrecy, and a willingness to move before anyone could stop them. This was the breaking point, though not yet the break. The monarchy still stood. Farouk still reigned. The palace still had servants, guards, clocks, carpets, telephones, files, and routines. A state rarely announces that its legitimacy has expired. It continues to function, sometimes quite normally, while the inner agreement that sustains it quietly dissolves. That is what makes the late monarchy so haunting. From the outside, Egypt still had a king. From the inside, more and more people were imagining a future without one. The 1948 war did not make revolution inevitable. History is never that neat. Different choices might have delayed the collapse or changed its form, but the war gave the monarchy's enemies something stronger than complaint. It gave them an indictment. It gave the army a grievance sharpened by lived experience. It gave the public a story in which palace corruption, foreign domination, political decay, and military humiliation could be tied together. Once those threads were tied, they were difficult to untangle. Farouk's crown had survived rumors. It had survived political conflict. It had survived British pressure, though not without damage. But after the humiliation of war, the monarchy faced a more dangerous enemy. A generation of men who believed they had seen the truth of the regime from the front lines, and who decided that waiting was another form of surrender. The coup was not yet visible, but in officer clubs, private apartments, guarded conversations, and the bitter privacy of men who had returned from defeat, the old kingdom had already begun to lose the loyalty of those trained to defend it. The men who brought down Egypt's monarchy did not begin as statues. That matters, because later history tends to polish revolutionaries into symbols. It gives them clean motives, firm outlines, and faces suitable for posters. But before they became the free officers of national memory, they were younger men moving through a country that had taught them disappointment. They were soldiers with careers, grievances, private ambitions, ideological differences, and a shared sense that Egypt's ruling order had become intolerable. They did not all imagine the same future, but they increasingly agreed on the same enemy. The monarchy to them was not only a palace. It was the visible peak of a system that included British influence, corrupt politics, social inequality, military humiliation, and an elite world that seemed insulated from consequence. Farouk was useful as a target because he made the whole arrangement easier to picture. A king with a damaged reputation gave anger a face. Yet the free officers' movement was not born from outrage alone. Outrage is common. Organization is rarer. After the 1948 war, resentment inside the army took on a sharper form. Officers who had witnessed defeat returned with stories that were repeated in mess halls, private homes, and guarded conversations. They spoke of failure in command, weakness in preparation, and the sense that men at the front had paid for corruption at the top. The details varied, and memory often simplifies after trauma, but the emotional result was unmistakable. A generation of officers began to see itself as morally superior to the politicians and courtiers who had sent them into disaster. That feeling can be powerful. It can also be dangerous. Military men who believe they alone understand the nation's suffering may become impatient with all civilian disorder. They may begin with patriotic frustration and end by convincing themselves that secrecy is virtue, discipline is legitimacy, and power taken quickly can be justified by failure elsewhere. This is not to dismiss their grievances. Many were real. It is to notice the hard edge forming beneath them. The free officers were shaped by humiliation, but also by the habits of the institution they belonged to. Armies teach hierarchy, timing, loyalty, and concealment. A political party must persuade crowds. A military conspiracy must know who can be trusted, which units matter, which commanders might hesitate, and how to move before the state understands what is happening. The movement developed quietly, not as one grand, dramatic council from the beginning. but through networks of officers who shared anger and tested loyalties. Names that would later dominate Egyptian history began to gather force inside this hidden world. Muhammad Naguib, older and respected, offered the movement a public face with military prestige. Gamal Abdel Nasser, younger and more politically driven, became one of its central organizers. Around them stood other officers who believed the monarchy had lost the right to command Egypt's future. The relationship between Naguib and Nasser is important because it reveals something about the movement's nature. Revolutions often need two kinds of authority. They need the recognizable figure who reassures people, and the organizing mind that makes the machinery work. Naguib had status, seniority, and a reputation that could make the movement look less like a reckless mutiny. Nasser had energy, discipline, and a clearer revolutionary instinct. At first, these qualities could cooperate. Later, they would collide. But in the shadow before the coup, each helped compensate for what the other lacked. The conspiracy grew in a country where faith in ordinary politics had weakened. That was essential. A coup cannot succeed by military planning alone. It needs a surrounding atmosphere in which enough people are willing to accept the collapse of the old order, or at least not defend it with conviction. By the early 1950s, the monarchy had many critics and few true believers prepared to risk everything for it. The British presence remained a central wound, especially around the Suez Canal zone. Anti-British anger intensified. Violence and confrontation fed the sense that Egypt was trapped between occupation and incompetence. The palace seemed unable to deliver full independence. Politicians seemed unable to create durable authority. The army, bruised from war and full of restless men, became a place where national frustration could harden into plans. It is worth pausing here, because the word coup can make the event sound sudden, almost mechanical. Tanks move, radio stations are seized, a king abdicates, a flag changes meaning. But by the time soldiers move in the open, the decisive work has often already happened in private. The free officers had to think in practical terms. Which units could be relied upon? Which commanders had to be neutralized? How could they avoid giving Farouk time to rally loyal forces? How would they speak to the public afterward? Would they claim reform, national salvation, purification, anti-corruption, independence, or all of these at once? A military conspiracy requires not only anger, but choreography. There was also risk. Failure could mean prison, execution, disgrace, or a purge of sympathetic officers. Conspirators often look inevitable only after they win. Before victory, they are men living inside uncertainty, trying to read glances and silences, never fully sure who might inform against them. This uncertainty gives the free officers' rise its real tension. They were not simply marching toward destiny. They were improvising within a decaying system, encouraged by the monarchy's weakness, but not guaranteed success. Farouk still had loyalists. The state still had institutions. The British still had interests. Political parties still existed. A failed move could have strengthened the throne, at least temporarily, by allowing it to present itself as the defender of order against military rebellion. So the free officers waited, watched, and prepared. The political crisis of 1952 gave them their opening. Egypt had entered a state of deep instability. The old pattern of changing cabinets and managing factions no longer seemed like governance. It seemed like exhaustion. The Cairo fire of January 1952, When large parts of the city's European and foreign-associated commercial life were attacked and burned amid anti-British anger and political chaos, became one of the clearest signs that the state was losing control. The exact responsibilities behind that day remained debated, but its meaning was plain enough. The kingdom could no longer guarantee order in its own capital. That kind of spectacle can finish an institution's moral authority, not because every citizen supports revolution afterward, but because people begin to believe that something has already broken. Once the state looks hollow, those willing to seize it become bolder. Farouk's response to the mounting crisis was not enough. Cabinet changes came and went. Palace maneuvers continued. The king still occupied the center of official life, but the center no longer held the same force. His enemies were no longer merely writing editorials or whispering in salons. They were inside the army, with plans. The free officers' genius, if we can use that word cautiously, was to understand that they did not need to defeat a strong monarchy. They needed to move decisively against a weak one before it could remember how to be strong. Speed would matter. Surprise would matter. Control of communications would matter. The appearance of national purpose would matter almost as much as actual command. They prepared to present themselves not as ambitious men seizing power, but as servants of Egypt rescuing the country from corruption and humiliation. That claim would become the moral language of the revolution. Whether one accepts it fully is another question. What is clear is that by 1952, many Egyptians were ready to hear it. The monarchy had lost the argument before it lost the palace. In the dark, the free officers were no longer only complaining about Egypt's decay. They were arranging the practical end of a dynasty. Maps, names, barracks, orders, loyalties. These quiet things became more important than royal speeches. The old kingdom still had its ceremonies, but the future was being drafted elsewhere, by men who had learned to speak softly because the first sound of open rebellion had to be final. And soon, Egypt would wake to discover that the throne had not been challenged in parliament, mocked in a newspaper, or embarrassed by rumor. It had been surrounded by its own army. The end of the Egyptian monarchy did not arrive like the ending of an opera. There was no ancient curse, no final battle at the palace gates, no king standing on a balcony while the city roared beneath him. The fall came with a stranger, colder efficiency. Orders moved, units took positions, communications were controlled, senior officers were contained. The state woke to find that the men who claimed to serve it had quietly changed its center of gravity. In the early hours of July 23, 1952, the free officers made their move. They acted before hesitation could gather around them. That was the point. A coup is often less a contest of strength than a contest of timing. If the conspirators move too early, they are isolated. If they move too late, they are exposed. But if they move at the precise moment, when the old system is tired, discredited, and unsure of itself, they can appear almost larger than they are. The monarchy was not destroyed by a crowd storming the royal residence. It was bypassed. This is one of the most revealing details of Farouk's final days. His rule collapsed not because every lever of state power had vanished, but because the crucial levers no longer responded to him quickly enough. The army, or at least the units that mattered in that moment, had shifted. The conspirators controlled enough of the machinery to make resistance dangerous and perhaps futile. The king still had a crown, but the crown could not command the night. By morning, Egypt heard the language of salvation. The officers did not present themselves as men hungry for power. They spoke of corruption, defeat, national dignity, and the need to rescue the country. This language was carefully chosen because it touched the wounds everyone knew. The humiliation of 1948. The scandals of the palace. The failures of politicians. The British presence. The exhaustion of ordinary people who had watched the kingdom argue with itself while the country's deeper problems remained. A successful coup must sound at first like an answer. Farouk was at Alexandria when the crisis closed around him. Alexandria had long been one of the monarchy's favorite stages. Mediterranean air, royal residences, summer rituals, cosmopolitan society, the sea softening the edges of power. But in July 1952, the city became the setting for retreat. The palace world that had once seemed insulated now found itself exposed to military pressure. The king's position weakened with astonishing speed. He could have tried to resist. That possibility has always hovered over the story. He still had prestige among some loyalists. He still occupied the legal throne. A monarchy does not normally vanish simply because a group of officers dislikes it. But Farouk faced a brutal calculation. Resistance could bring bloodshed, perhaps civil conflict, and perhaps British complications. It could also fail quickly, leaving him not only deposed, but humiliated in a more violent way. The free officers, for their part, did not initially abolish the monarchy. This restraint was tactical as much as constitutional. They demanded Farouk's abdication in favor of his infant son, Ahmed Fuad, who became Fuad II. That arrangement allowed them to remove the discredited king while avoiding, for the moment, the shock of declaring a republic. It gave the revolution a legal bridge. The throne would remain, but emptied of real authority. Farouk signed the abdication on July 26, 1952. The scene has the quiet cruelty of political endings. A man born into ceremony was reduced to a signature. The king, who had once been greeted as Egypt's golden boy, now surrendered the crown to a child too young to know what had been given to him or taken from him. There is something almost absurd in that transfer, but also something deeply revealing. Dynasties depend on continuity, yet here, continuity became a way to disguise collapse. The royal yacht Marusa waited to carry Farouk away. That image has survived because it feels designed by history with an artist's eye. The fallen king departing Egypt by sea, not in chains, not before a firing squad, but in a kind of floating exile. The same monarchy that had staged itself through palaces, uniforms, and ceremonies now staged its final act as departure. Farouk left with members of his family, saluted by those who still observed the formalities. Even revolution, in that moment, allowed the old world its manners. There was dignity in the choreography, but not power. The officers had decided the future. Farouk was being permitted to exit it. A small detail gives the scene its human weight. Farouk was still a relatively young man. He was not an ancient monarch at the natural end of a reign. He was a king in middle age, forced out after a collapse that had moved faster than his ability to understand or reverse it. Whatever one thinks of his failures, and they were serious, the speed of his fall reminds us that political legitimacy can appear solid until it suddenly behaves like glass. The people of Egypt did not experience the abdication in one uniform emotion. Some celebrated, some watched cautiously, Some may have felt relief without knowing what would come next. Some royalists mourned privately. Many were simply trying to understand whether this was reform, revolution, military correction, or the beginning of something far larger. The free officers benefited from that uncertainty. They did not need every Egyptian to know exactly what the movement meant. They needed the old regime to seem finished, and they needed themselves to seem disciplined enough to replace it. Muhammad Naguib's public role helped reassure a country wary of chaos. Nasser and the inner circle moved with increasing confidence behind the scenes. The Revolutionary Command Council would soon become the real center of authority. But in those final July days, the monarchy still existed in law. Egypt had not yet become a republic. The royal family had not yet been erased from official memory. The infant Fuad II was, technically, king. Technically. That word is where the whole tragedy sits. A throne can survive in documents after it has died in politics. Titles can continue after command has moved elsewhere. A royal seal can remain meaningful to lawyers while soldiers decide the fate of ministries. The free officers understood this gap perfectly. They could afford to leave the crown in place for a little while because they had already removed the substance beneath it. This is why the fall of Farouk feels so silent, compared with the scale of what it ended. More than a century of dynastic rule did not conclude with a grand confrontation between monarchy and people. It ended through pressure, paperwork, calculation, and a departure across the water. The throne was not smashed in public. It was hollowed out, then passed to a baby. And perhaps that silence is why the story became so easy to simplify afterward. Republican memory would often portray the event as the cleansing of a corrupt old order. Royalist memory would see betrayal, humiliation, and the loss of a world. Both memories contain emotion. Neither fully captures the strangeness of the moment itself. A king removed, a child crowned, a revolution not yet fully named, and a nation suspended between legal continuity and political rupture. Farouk sailed away aboard the Mahrusa, leaving behind palaces, enemies, servants, documents, rumors, debts of reputation, and the burden of a dynasty no longer able to defend itself. The coastline receded. Egypt remained. The crown remained too, but only as a shell. For one brief moment, the country possessed the most fragile kind of monarchy imaginable, a kingdom without a ruling king, a revolution without a republic, and an infant sovereign whose throne had already become an empty room. After Farouk sailed away, Egypt still had a king. That fact sounds almost unreal, because the monarchy had already suffered its decisive defeat. The man who embodied its glamour, scandal, weakness, and public resentment was gone. The army had acted. The Revolutionary Command Council was becoming the center of political life. The old palace world had been stunned into obedience, and yet, on paper, the crown passed to an infant. Fuad II became king before he could speak the word Egypt with understanding. He could not issue commands, choose ministers, receive ambassadors with intention, or grasp the meaning of the documents written in his name. His reign began not as power, but as arrangement. He was useful precisely because he was powerless. This is the strange brilliance of the free officers' decision to keep the monarchy alive for a little while. By forcing Farouk to abdicate in favor of his son, they avoided making the revolution look immediately radical. They could present themselves as correcting the kingdom rather than abolishing it. They removed the discredited father, preserved the legal form, and gave cautious Egyptians time to adjust to the new reality. The baby king made the coup look less like a rupture, but he also revealed that the rupture had already happened. A monarchy depends on the idea that blood carries authority across time. The death, removal, or abdication of one ruler is not supposed to end the institution because the next body in the line absorbs the sacred fiction of continuity. This is the quiet magic of dynastic politics. A child can inherit what armies defend, ministers administer, and citizens are asked to respect. But in Egypt in 1952, the magic failed. Fuad II inherited the title, not the obedience. He inherited the crown, not the state. Real decisions belonged to the officers who had surrounded Farouk and now spoke in the language of national salvation. The infant's kingship was a curtain left hanging after the stage had been cleared. There was, of course, a regency arrangement. A child monarch cannot rule directly. In older dynastic settings, this might have created a powerful regent, a court faction, or a struggle among royal relatives. But Egypt's situation was different. The problem was not simply that the king was too young. The problem was that the revolution had already moved authority out of the royal household. The regency could not restore what the coup had taken. The palace still existed. Protocol did not vanish overnight. Documents could still carry royal language. Officials could still pretend, for a time, that the kingdom remained intact. But the old system had lost the one thing ceremony cannot replace: the expectation that the monarch's will mattered. This is where Fuad II's brief reign becomes more than a curiosity. It exposes the difference between legality and power. Legality often moves slowly, carefully, with seals, signatures, proclamations, and formulas. Power can move in a night. In July 1952, legality said Egypt remained a monarchy. Power said Egypt was now governed by officers. For several months, the country lived inside that contradiction. The world had not yet been given the final Republican declaration, but the throne was already reduced to a symbol waiting to be retired. And what a symbol it was. An infant king is normally an invitation to loyalty. He suggests innocence, continuity, and the future. He cannot be blamed for the sins of his father. He cannot yet offend the public, dismiss a cabinet, gamble away respect, or become the subject of scandal. In theory, Fuad II should have offered the monarchy a chance to purify itself. The dynasty could say, "The old king is gone, but the house remains. Let the child grow into a better sovereign." That argument might have worked in another country or at another moment. In Egypt, it was already too late. The public anger was not directed only at Farouk as an individual. It had attached itself to the structure around him: the palace, the old elite, the compromises with foreign power, the failures of war, the inequalities of land and status, the sense that Egypt's dignity had been managed rather than restored. Removing Farouk did not answer those grievances. It merely took away their most visible face. The free officers understood that keeping Fuad II permanently would eventually become inconvenient. A child grows. A symbol gathers supporters. Foreign powers learn to use legal ambiguities. Royalists can wait. Courtiers can whisper about restoration. Even a powerless monarch can become a point around which opposition forms. The officers had not risked everything in order to become guardians of a revived dynasty. So the infant's reign functioned as a pause, not a genuine restoration, not a stable constitutional experiment. A pause. During that pause, the revolutionary regime consolidated itself. It investigated, dismissed, reorganized, and positioned itself as the force that would cleanse public life. The language of reform grew stronger. The monarchy's remaining dignity grew thinner. Farouk's exile made the old world seem distant. Fuad's infancy made it seem absurd. Egypt had a king who could not rule, while the men who could rule had no crown and increasingly no need for one. There is something almost cruel in the innocence of Fuad II's position. He became the final holder of a dynasty's title without ever participating in the dynasty's choices. He bore the consequences of Muhammad Ali's ambition, Ismail's debts, Fuad I's royal centralization, Farouk's reputation, Britain's interference, the War of 1948, and the Free Officers' conspiracy, all before he had a memory of his own. History sometimes places its heaviest symbols on those least able to carry them. This is why the image of the baby king stays with us. Not because he ruled. He did not. Not because he made a dramatic decision. He could not. But because his presence reveals the final emptiness of the throne. The dynasty had once begun with a commander gathering real power before he possessed royal language. It ended with a child possessing royal language after real power had gone. The symmetry is almost too sharp. Muhammad Ali had turned authority into heredity. Fuad II showed that heredity could not preserve authority once the state, the army, and the public imagination had moved on. By early 1953, the question was no longer whether Fuad II would rule. It was how long the fiction would be maintained. Every passing month made the arrangement feel less like continuity and more like delay. The officers were learning that they could govern without the crown. The people were learning that daily life continued without a reigning adult monarch. Foreign governments were learning where decisions were actually made. The throne had become ceremonial without even the comfort of ceremony. For centuries, monarchies had survived by turning children into vessels of future power. Egypt's last monarchy turned a child into a vessel of postponed abolition. His name appeared where authority used to be. His title preserved a shape whose substance had disappeared. And then, when the Republic finally came, even that shape would be taken away. Fuad II's reign lasted less than a year, but its brevity is exactly what gives it meaning. It was not a chapter of rule. It was the thin line between a fallen king and an abolished monarchy, between dynastic memory and republican erasure. It was Egypt's last moment of pretending that the old order might still breathe. The baby king did not lose the throne. He inherited it after it had already been lost. A monarchy can be overthrown in a few days. Erasing it takes longer. By 1953, Egypt's royal fiction had become too thin to protect. Fuad II was still king in name, but the country was no longer being governed through the old logic of palace, dynasty, and inherited authority. The Revolutionary Command Council held the real power. The officers had removed Farouk, steadied their position, and begun presenting themselves as the only force capable of rescuing Egypt from corruption, foreign domination, and political decay. On June 18, 1953, the monarchy was formally abolished. Egypt became a republic, The declaration did more than change the head of state. It changed the official meaning of the past. The Muhammad Ali Dynasty, which had once claimed to modernize Egypt, represent its sovereignty, and embody its dignity, was now recast as the symbol of everything the revolution claimed to have defeated. The royal family became shorthand for decadence. The palace became shorthand for corruption. The crown became shorthand for dependency. This is how revolutions often work. They do not only seize institutions, they seize interpretation. The new regime needed a clean story, and clean stories require villains. Farouk was almost too useful. His reputation had already been damaged by scandal, excess, political failure, and the humiliation of war. In the Republican telling, he could stand for the whole old order, greedy, weak, foreign-shaped, morally exhausted, unworthy of a people demanding dignity. There was truth in parts of that portrait. Farouk's reign had given his enemies plenty to use. The monarchy had been compromised by British influence. It had failed to build stable constitutional legitimacy. It had become associated with elite privilege and court intrigue. Its image of national splendor had grown harder to defend in a country marked by inequality and anger. But official memory rarely stops at truth. It arranges truth into a weapon. The Republic did not need Egyptians to remember the dynasty as complicated. It needed them to remember it as finished. This meant compressing more than a century of rule into a moral contrast. Before the revolution, corruption and humiliation. After the revolution, dignity and national renewal. That contrast was politically powerful, but historically incomplete, because the Muhammad Ali dynasty was not only Farouk's scandals, it was also Muhammad Ali's state-building, military reform, agricultural transformation, new schools, expanding bureaucracy, and the early architecture of modern Egyptian governance. It was Ismail's ambition and debt. It was Fuad I's attempt to make monarchy into a national institution. It was the paradox of rulers who helped build modern Egypt while also deepening forms of control, inequality, and dependency. A republic built on revolution had little patience for such ambiguity. The old royal world was pushed into disgrace. Titles lost force. Properties could be seized. Palaces were repurposed, renamed, opened, closed, or absorbed into the machinery of the new state. Images of the monarchy survived, but often as evidence against it. The chandelier, the banquet table, the royal bedroom, the imported car, all could be made to testify. Objects that once performed legitimacy now performed accusation. This is one of history's quieter cruelties. The same room can change meanings without moving a chair. Under the kings, a palace could say, "Egypt is sovereign, refined, and worthy of recognition." Under the Republic, the same palace could say, "Look how they lived while the people suffered." Neither reading is entirely false. Neither is complete. But the second reading became more useful to the new regime because it justified the break. Memory became policy. Schools, speeches, newspapers, films, commemorations, and public language increasingly taught Egyptians to see the monarchy as an embarrassing prelude to the true national story. The revolution presented itself not merely as a change in government, but as the recovery of Egypt from a corrupt class that had failed to defend independence. In that version, the royal family had not simply lost power, it had been exposed. This exposure had an emotional appeal. Many Egyptians had good reasons to resent the old order. The rural poor, urban workers, junior officers, students, and nationalists did not need propaganda to feel that something had been wrong. The Republic's story worked because it connected with lived frustration. It offered a satisfying explanation for humiliation. Egypt had suffered because the old rulers were decadent, compromised, and detached. Remove them, and the nation could stand upright. Yet the danger of satisfying explanations is that they can become too satisfying. They can flatten the past until it no longer teaches. If the monarchy fell only because Farouk was corrupt, then the deeper structures disappear. Foreign financial control, imperial strategy, constitutional conflict, land inequality, elite politics, military resentment, and the difficult transition from dynasty to nation. A scapegoat can clarify anger while obscuring causes. The Republic's erasure of the dynasty also protected the new rulers from comparison. If the monarchy represented only decay, then the revolution represented necessity. If the palace represented only foreign influence, then the officers could claim the language of pure national will. If Farouk was the symbol of failure, then the men who removed him could inherit the symbol of rescue. That inheritance was not neutral. The free officers had come to power promising reform, dignity, and liberation from the failures of the old system. To maintain that moral authority, they had to keep the monarchy safely buried in public memory. A complicated royal past might invite complicated questions about the revolutionary present. A purely rotten royal past was much easier to govern against. So Egypt's last dynasty faded from daily national imagination. Not entirely, of course. Families remembered. Exiles remembered. Royalists remembered. Historians remembered. Palaces remained. Photographs survived. Fuad II lived abroad, carrying a title emptied by decree. But in the official story of modern Egypt, the monarchy became a warning more than an inheritance. This is what it means for a dynasty to disappear from public memory. It does not mean every trace is destroyed. It means the traces are given a narrow role. The royal family may be mentioned, but mainly to explain why the revolution was necessary. The kings may appear, but mostly as figures of decadence or weakness. The palaces may remain, but as museums of excess, not as parts of a national debate about modernization, sovereignty, and power. The Republic did not erase the Muhammad Ali dynasty by making it invisible. It erased it by making it simple. And perhaps that was the most effective erasure of all. A dynasty that had been born from contradiction, foreign and Egyptian, Ottoman and national, modernizing and authoritarian, glamorous and fragile, was reduced to a single lesson. This was the old world, and the old world deserved to fall. But history is rarely so obedient. Beneath the official verdict, unresolved questions remained. What did Egypt owe to the dynasty that helped build its modern state? What did it suffer because of that same dynasty's ambitions and failures? Could the monarchy have evolved into a constitutional symbol, or had its legitimacy been too badly damaged? Did the Republic liberate memory, or replace one political myth with another? The new Egypt did not want to linger over those questions. It had a future to announce, and futures, especially revolutionary ones, often begin by deciding which parts of the past must be made quiet. Exile is not only a change of address for a royal family, Exile is the loss of the stage on which every gesture once had meaning. A prince can still own memories. A former king can still carry titles in conversation. A child can still inherit a name heavy with ceremony. But without the country, without the palace machinery, without the officials, guards, petitions, newspapers, and crowds, royalty becomes strangely private. After 1952, this was the fate of Egypt's last royal house. Farouk left aboard the Marusa with the remnants of a life that had once seemed untouchable. He had been born into rooms designed to convince people that monarchy was permanent. Now permanence had narrowed to luggage, family, servants, documents, and whatever dignity could be preserved in departure. The sea carried him away from Egypt, but not away from the judgment of Egypt. In exile, he remained useful to his enemies as a symbol of the old world's failure. That is one of exile's cruelties. The fallen ruler loses power, but not blame. Farouk eventually settled abroad, especially in Italy, where he lived out the remainder of his life far from the country he had once ruled. Accounts of his exile often lean into the grotesque. The weight gain, the restaurants, the rumors, the decline from king to caricature. Some of this reflects real deterioration. Some of it reflects the appetite people have for seeing the mighty made ridiculous. A fallen monarch is rarely allowed an ordinary sadness. He must either become tragic or absurd. Farouk became both. It is possible to hold two thoughts at once. He had failed as king in serious ways. He also became, after his fall, a man cut loose from the only role he had been trained to perform. That does not excuse his failures, but it gives the ending a human dimension. Monarchy can damage those beneath it, but it can also deform those born inside it. Farouk had been raised as a symbol before he had fully become a person. When the symbol was destroyed, the person left behind did not seem well prepared for freedom. His son's exile was different, and in some ways stranger. Fuad II did not leave Egypt with memories of ruling it. He left with a title that history had already emptied. He grew up abroad as the last king of a country he barely knew from experience. For him, monarchy was not a lost daily routine of audiences, ceremonies, and command. It was an inheritance of absence, a name, a family story, a vanished world described by adults, and a public identity shaped by events that happened before consciousness could hold them. This makes Fuad II one of the most unusual figures in modern royal history. A king without a reign in the ordinary sense, an exile before memory, a living conclusion to a dynasty whose real end had occurred around him rather than through him. What does such a person do with a crown that no longer exists? There is no easy answer. Some exiled royals become political campaigners. Some become symbols for restoration movements. Some disappear into private life. Some cultivate nostalgia. Some spend their lives negotiating the difference between legal identity, family memory, and the reality that the country has moved on. Fuad II's life abroad belonged to this quieter category of historical survival. The title remained attached to him in royalist circles, but Egypt had become a republic. The state no longer required him. Official memory had little room for him except as a footnote to abolition. He was both historically significant and politically unnecessary, which is a lonely combination. The wider royal family scattered into this same uncertain condition. Titles that once opened doors could become burdens. Names that once signaled privilege could invite suspicion or curiosity. Properties had been lost or transformed. The court networks that had sustained royal life were broken. Marriages, identities, languages, and careers had to be remade in foreign settings. The family did not vanish biologically, but it ceased to function as the center of a national order. A dynasty without a kingdom becomes a family arguing with memory. Some members carried the old world with pride. Others adapted more quietly. Some were remembered only in genealogies, photographs, or occasional interviews. The emotional cost of this scattering is difficult to measure because royal exile is often described from the outside, through spectacle. We see the fallen title, the lost jewels, the confiscated palace, the dramatic departure. We do not always see the smaller losses, the inability to return casually, the child growing up with a country as an idea, the family story that sounds grand to strangers but painful at the dinner table. There is also the question of language. Royal houses in exile often live between tongues. Arabic, French, English, Italian, and other languages could shape the scattered life of Egypt's former elites. Language becomes more than communication. It becomes a map of belonging and distance. To speak of Egypt from abroad is not the same as speaking from within it. The homeland becomes sharper in imagination and less available in daily life. For Farouk, exile was a fall from excess. For Fuad II, exile was the original condition. That difference matters. Farouk could compare everything to what he had lost. Fuad had to construct an identity around something he had never possessed in practice. The father had been dethroned. The son had been uncrowned by time. And around them, the world changed. The Egypt that emerged after the monarchy did not freeze in 1953. It moved through Nasser's republic, Arab nationalism, land reform, Suez, war, state socialism, later political shifts, and new generations who knew the royal family mostly through fragments. For many Egyptians born after the revolution, Farouk and Fuad II belonged less to living politics than to old photographs, films, palace tours, family anecdotes, and arguments about whether the past had been better or worse than the present. Nostalgia complicated the picture. As decades passed, some people began to look back at the monarchy with curiosity, even softness. Old Cairo photographs, royal weddings, elegant streets, cosmopolitan Alexandria, and images of a vanished elite could appear seductive, especially when compared with later disappointments. But nostalgia has its own distortions. It remembers the polished surface more easily than the rural poverty, political exclusion, foreign domination, and anger that made the monarchy vulnerable in the first place. Republican memory had flattened the dynasty into decadence. Nostalgia sometimes flattened it into glamour. Neither is honest enough. The scattered heirs of the Muhammad Ali dynasty live inside that tension. They are reminders that history does not end as neatly as regimes announce. A republic may abolish titles, but it cannot abolish dissent. It can seize palaces, but not every memory attached to them. It can rewrite textbooks, but not prevent later generations from asking whether the old story was more complicated than they were told. And yet, the existence of heirs does not mean the monarchy remains alive in any political sense. Bloodline can survive without authority. A surname can outlive a state system. A former king can give interviews, attend family occasions, or be mentioned in articles. But the structure that once made his existence politically decisive is gone. This is the quiet afterlife of dethroned families. They remain visible enough to fascinate, but not powerful enough to command. They become living archives, carrying names that open questions rather than doors. Their lives are shaped by a peculiar tension between ordinary human adaptation and extraordinary historical label. They must become private people while the world insists on reading them as symbols. Farouk's exile ended with his death far from Egypt. Fuad II continued living as the last bearer of a title abolished when he was still a child. Between them stands the emotional arc of the fallen dynasty. The king who lost everything he had known, and the king who inherited only the fact of loss. That is not the grandest ending imaginable, but it may be the truest. The Muhammad Ali dynasty did not disappear in one clean stroke. It dispersed. It became private. It moved into foreign streets, family albums, contested memories, and the uneasy space between history and gossip. The royal house survived as bloodline, but not as destiny. The kingdom was gone, and the people born from it had to learn how to live after history had closed the door behind them. The hardest histories are not the ones buried completely. They are the ones remembered badly. Egypt's royal family did not vanish because every trace was destroyed. The palaces remained. Photographs survived. Names could still be found in books, archives, family stories, old newspapers, and the memories of those who had lived through the kingdom's final years. Even the last king, Fuad II, remained alive abroad as a reminder that the dynasty had not ended in blood, but in displacement. And yet, for many people, the monarchy became strangely unreal, not absent exactly, but flattened. It was reduced to a few familiar images: Farouk's appetites, palace luxury, British influence, corrupt politicians, the shame of 1948, the free officers arriving as a necessary correction. In another mood, it became the opposite image: elegant Cairo, cosmopolitan Alexandria, royal ceremonies, old manners, a lost world of refinement before revolution and militarized politics changed the country. One version condemns too easily. The other forgives too quickly. The truth is more uncomfortable because the Muhammad Ali dynasty cannot be placed neatly in either box. It was not simply a foreign imposition that did nothing but exploit Egypt. It was also not a golden age cruelly interrupted by ungrateful officers. It was a ruling house that helped build many structures of modern Egypt, while also presiding over coercion, inequality, dependency, and political failure. That is why it remains difficult to remember honestly. Muhammad Ali and his descendants shaped the Egyptian state in profound ways. They expanded bureaucracy, reorganized the army, developed education, pushed agricultural and industrial projects, and made Egypt more visible in the politics of the Mediterranean and the wider world. Their rule helped move Egypt from the loose arrangements of Ottoman provincial life toward a more centralized modern state. But modern state building is not the same as national liberation. The same machinery that built schools and armies also taxed, conscripted, disciplined, and extracted. The same rulers who sought autonomy from the Ottoman Empire and prestige before Europe also relied on authoritarian control at home. The same dynasty that claimed to make Egypt strong helped entangle it in debt and foreign influence. The same court that performed sovereignty often lived under the pressure of Britain. So what should Egypt remember? The builders, the exploiters, the modernizers, the collaborators? The answer is yes, but not in equal measure at every moment, and not without context. This is where public memory struggles. Nations often prefer ancestors who are either heroic or guilty. A mixed inheritance is harder to teach, harder to commemorate, and harder to use politically. The Muhammad Ali dynasty is mixed in exactly this inconvenient way. It produced state power, but not democratic accountability. It pursued progress, but often through command. It performed Egyptian dignity, but never fully escaped foreign pressure. It offered glamour, but that glamour stood beside poverty. And Farouk, in particular, made nuance difficult. A single discredited monarch can drag an entire dynasty into moral shorthand. Farouk's failures were real enough to become useful, and once they became useful, they became enormous. The Republic could point to him and say, "This is what we ended." A king's jewels, pleasures, scandals, and humiliations became easier to explain than the deeper forces that had weakened the monarchy for decades. But blaming Farouk for everything lets too many structures escape. The monarchy did not fall only because one king behaved badly. It fell because legitimacy had been eroded across generations. British occupation damaged the meaning of sovereignty. Debt and foreign control weakened the dynasty's claim to independence. Palace interference undermined constitutional trust. Social inequality made royal luxury look insulting. The 1948 war turned frustration into indictment. The army became a political actor convinced that the old order could not reform itself. Farouk was the face of collapse. He was not the whole cause. At the same time, defending the dynasty by pointing to modernization also avoids the full reckoning. A railway, a ministry, or a school does not cancel the suffering of forced labor, conscription, rural poverty, or political repression. A palace can be architecturally beautiful and socially obscene. A ruler can advance the state while narrowing the lives of those underneath it. History does not require us to choose only one truth when several are visible. This is the problem with nostalgia. It edits pain out of beauty. Look at an old photograph of royal-era Cairo, and it is easy to feel the pull of loss. The streets may seem elegant, the clothes are formal, the city appears confident, layered, worldly. Compared with later disappointments, the past can acquire a soft glow. But photographs have borders. They show what stood inside the frame. They do not show everyone excluded from it. Republican memory had the opposite flaw. It edited achievement out of guilt. In the revolutionary story, the monarchy became a symbol of decadence and foreign dependence. That made political sense. New regimes need moral contrast, and Egypt's officers needed to justify not only the removal of Farouk, but the transfer of power into military hands. The old world had to look exhausted, so the new one could look necessary. But when a nation remembers only the crimes of a fallen order, it can miss the continuities that survive beneath revolution. Centralized authority did not disappear with the king. The habit of ruling from above did not begin in 1952, and it did not end there. The state Muhammad Ali helped build had always contained a strong, commanding impulse. The Republic inherited more of that impulse than it always admitted. That may be the most important forgotten point. The revolution did not come from outside Egyptian history to cleanse it. It came from within structures the dynasty had helped create. A centralized state, a politically conscious army, a public language of national dignity and frustration with foreign control. In that sense, the Muhammad Ali dynasty helped produce both modern Egypt and the forces that overthrew the monarchy. The throne raised the army removed the throne. There is a severe irony in that, but also a lesson. Institutions often create their own successors without meaning to. Muhammad Ali built military power to secure his rule. Later rulers cultivated state authority to strengthen the dynasty. Over time, that state produced officers who judged the dynasty unnecessary. The tools of royal survival became the instruments of royal abolition. So why did Egypt choose to forget? Not because the dynasty was insignificant. Insignificant things do not require erasure. Egypt forgot, or half forgot, because the dynasty was too complicated. It raised questions that neither monarchists nor republicans could answer comfortably. If the kings were only corrupt, why did their state building matter so much? If the dynasty was truly national, why did so many Egyptians come to see it as foreign-shaped and compromised? If the Republic liberated Egypt from the old order, why did some habits of centralized rule remain familiar? These questions do not fit easily on monuments. They belong in quieter places: archives, conversations, documentaries, late-night arguments, family memories, and the uneasy feeling that the past has been made simpler than it was. To remember the Muhammad Ali dynasty honestly is not to restore it. It is not to polish Farouk's crown or condemn every revolutionary who opposed him. It is to admit that Egypt's modern history was shaped by people who could build and damage at the same time. It is to see that sovereignty can be performed before it is achieved, that modernization can arrive with coercion, and that glamour can hide weakness without inventing it. The dynasty remains difficult because it refuses to be only one thing. It was foreign-born and Egyptian-made, modernizing and authoritarian, glamorous and fragile, ambitious for sovereignty and trapped by dependence. That is not a clean memory, but it is a human one. And perhaps the real disappearance of Egypt's royal family was never the loss of titles or palaces. It was the loss of complexity, the moment when a dynasty of contradictions became a slogan, and a century of uneasy state-building was reduced to the simple comfort of saying, they were the past, and the past was gone. Fuad II remains the final king of Egypt, though his kingdom vanished before he could understand it. That is the quiet strangeness at the end of this story. The last monarch of one of the most important modern dynasties in the Middle East was not overthrown after a long reign. He did not lose a war, dismiss a parliament, sign a disastrous treaty, or stand accused of ruining the state. He was a child placed on an empty throne because adults needed a legal bridge between monarchy and republic. His life became the after-image of a crown. Through Fuad II and his descendants, the bloodline of Muhammad Ali did not disappear. It continued, as families do, through births, marriages, private memories, and the stubborn survival of names. But a bloodline without power is a different thing from a dynasty. It no longer commands armies or opens parliament. It no longer appoints ministers or receives ambassadors as the living face of the state. It becomes historical evidence in human form. That may be why Fuad II's existence still feels so haunting. He is not a threat to modern Egypt. He is not the center of a serious restoration drama. He is something quieter, a reminder that regimes can end while people remain. The Republic could abolish the monarchy. It could strip titles of authority, repurpose palaces, rewrite the national story, and teach generations to associate the old royal house with decadence and dependency. But it could not undo the fact that this family had once shaped Egypt for more than a century. It could not make Muhammad Ali's reforms irrelevant, or Ismail's debts meaningless, or Fuad I's kingdom imaginary, or Farouk's fall less revealing. History can remove a crown from the present. It cannot always remove the questions the crown leaves behind. And the questions left by Egypt's royal bloodline are not simple. Was the Muhammad Ali dynasty a foreign dynasty that never fully became Egyptian, or a foreign-born house that became Egyptian through the state it built? Did it modernize Egypt, or discipline Egypt into serving elite ambition? Did the monarchy fail because Farouk was unworthy, or because the institution had been compromised long before he inherited it? Did the Republic rescue national memory, or narrow it into a more useful myth? The honest answer is that more than one thing is true. The dynasty built and exploited. It sought sovereignty and lived with dependency. It dressed Egypt in royal dignity while often failing to answer the hardship beneath that dignity. It gave the country institutions, but not enough trust. It created an arm that eventually decided the palace was no longer necessary. In the end, the last bloodline is not important because it might return to power. It is important because it keeps the story from becoming too neat. A vanished monarchy is easy to mock. A lost royal house is easy to romanticize. But a living descendant complicates both temptations. Fuad II reminds us that the final king was not a monster in a palace, but an infant carried by history into exile. His descendants remind us that political endings are not family endings. Behind every abolished title are people who must live with the ruins of a public story inside private life. Egypt moved on. It had to. Nations cannot remain forever at the dock watching a royal yacht fade into the horizon. The Republic built its own myths, fought its own battles, made its own promises, and created its own disappointments. The monarchy became a distant room in the national house, sometimes locked, sometimes toured, sometimes misremembered, sometimes suddenly relevant again when people wondered how the present had inherited the past. That is where this story leaves us. Not with a crown restored, not with a crown cursed, but with a throne that began in the hands of an ambitious outsider and ended in the name of a child. Between them stretched armies, canals, palaces, occupations, constitutions, scandals, wars, hopes, humiliations, and the long struggle over what Egypt was allowed to be. Fuad II was the baby king who vanished from history. But perhaps he vanished because he revealed too much. His empty reign showed that monarchy is not made of gold, blood, or ceremony alone. It survives only while enough people believe power still lives inside it. In Egypt, by 1953, that belief had gone elsewhere. And once belief leaves a throne, even a crown can become only an object waiting for a museum.